Okay, let's unpack this. For decades, space was, mostly about exploration, science, but lately there's this growing sense of its strategic importance and, well, the potential for conflict. We're really talking about a new kind of space race, aren't we? Not just flags on the moon, but securing, maybe even weaponizing the orbits right above us.
Yeah.
So this deep dive, it's really for you, the curious learner wanting to grasp space security without getting totally lost in jargon.
Yeah, and what's really striking is just how fast things are changing. Society leans so heavily on space tech now. I mean, your GPS, global comms, national security, all of it. So keeping space safe, secure, and, sustainable, it's not just a nice to have anymore. It's absolutely essential.
That really hits home how fundamental it is. And the sources we're digging into today, we've got reports from the Unidyre 2024 Outer Space Security Conference, Defense One on China's ASAT arsenal, insights on Russia's nuclear counterspace stuff.
Yep.
They really lay the challenges bare. Our mission here is to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and help you understand what's truly at stake. So when we talk about threats in space, what exactly are we looking at? It's definitely moved beyond sci-fi movies, right?
Oh, absolutely. The reality is space is getting more crowded, more contested, and that just ups the danger of, well, anything happening, accidents, deliberate acts, even natural events causing trouble. We're seeing a whole range of threats pop up. You've got kinetic anti-satellite weapons, ASATs designed to physically smash satellites, but also these non-kinetic counterspace assets.
Non-kinetic, so things that cause harm without actually, blowing stuff up.
Exactly, like cyber interference that can temporarily mess with or just block space systems.
Right.
Or technologies that can dazzle satellite sensors, blind them, essentially.
Right, blinding them. And that distinction, causing harm without destruction, sounds incredibly tricky to deal with.
It really is. One person at the Unidyre conference talked about the fog of peace, describing these sort of gray zone activities. They fall below that classic threshold of using force, but they're still harmful.
Gray zone. Interesting term.
Yeah, think about that cyber interference or dazzling. It disrupts vital systems and often hits civilian populations hardest. Another challenge is what they call the interchangeable nature of space assets, civilian systems getting used for military stuff. That just blurs the line between peaceful and hostile, Makes everything less predictable.
So that fog of peace isn't just about avoiding war. It's this murky area where harmful stuff happens. But it's hard to pin down intent or even respond without escalating. That's quite the insight. Okay, beyond general threats, which countries are developing the most worrying capabilities? What do our sources say about China?
Well, Defense One has reporting on China building out a pretty comprehensive counterspace arsenal. General Chance Saltzman, chief of space operations, called it a grave threat. This includes things like ground-based lasers. They could disrupt, degrade, maybe even damage satellite sensors. And the expectation is, by the mid to late 2020s, they might have lasers strong enough to physically damage satellite structures.
Wow, actual physical damage from lasers.
Yeah. And their military routinely uses jammers against space comms, radars, navigation systems, even hitting the Pentagon's EHF systems. Those are meant to be super jam resistant, so that shows you the level they're operating at.
That's concerning.
And then on the kinetic side, Saltzman mentioned satellites that can basically dogfight or physically grab another satellite out of orbit.
A full toolkit then.
Yeah.
And you mentioned China connecting these assets, this kill web idea.
Yes, Saltzman really highlighted that. China's aggressively building this kill web using hundreds of satellites to find, track, and target forces back on Earth. Think of it like a huge space-based targeting network. So for the U.S. Space Force, the job isn't just protecting their own satellites anymore. Now they also need to be able to deny China the use of its space assets. They call it space superiority. But, and this is a big but, Saltzman also said the Space Force is critically unfunded for these new missions.
Critically unfunded.
Yeah, especially for developing their own counter capabilities, both non-kinetic and kinetic, ground-based and space-based. Though he did say they prioritize non-kinetic effects. Physical destruction is really a last resort because of all the debris it creates.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's China. But Russia is also a major player here, raising concerns. What's the latest on their counterspace activities?
Well, U.S. officials reported a recent Russian launch, May 16th, 2024. They put a satellite into low Earth orbit that's assessed as likely being a counterspace weapon, probably able to attack other satellites. And what's really concerning is they put it in the same orbit as a U.S. government satellite.
That sounds deliberately provocative.
It certainly seems that way. And it's not their first time doing something like this. Assessment suggests it's similar to payloads they deployed back in 2019 and 2022. You might remember that nesting doll satellite from late 2019. It released a smaller satellite.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. It shadowed a U.S. spy satellite, didn't it?
Exactly. And later, that smaller sub-satellite even looked like it fired some kind of projectile.
Okay, so we're definitely seeing more capabilities, more concerning actions from multiple countries. And it's really worth pausing here for you listening, just to think about how much your daily life relies on these space systems. Getting directions, phone calls, weather forecasts, the stability up there, civilian or military, it really underpins so much of modern life. Now, while those non-kinetic and kinetic threats are unsettling enough, our sources point to something even more alarming. This alleged Russian space-based nuclear-armed anti-satellite weapon. I mean, that sounds like something from a Cold War thriller. What's the story there?
It is. Yeah, it's a profound danger. The first hints came in February 2024. House Intel Chair Mike Turner mentioned a serious national security threat. Then White House officials confirmed, yes, it was about a Russian space-based nuclear ASAT weapon.
A nuclear weapon in space.
Initially, the White House tried to downplay it a bit, said it wasn't active, not something to attack people or cause destruction on Earth. But later statements from John Plum, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, confirmed it is a nuclear weapon.
Okay, so how would that even work? A nuclear bomb in orbit?
The main concern is the effects. A nuclear detonation in space would create a massive electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, and a flood of highly charged particles radiating outwards. If it's powerful enough and detonated in the right place, it could potentially disable or destroy huge numbers of satellites across a vast area.
Crippling whole constellations.
Exactly. Assistant Secretary Plum said it could make low Earth orbit unusable for potentially up to a year, basically creating a minefield of dead satellites. That's why you hear analysts comparing it to the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of potential impact.
But the White House initially said it wouldn't harm humans or cause physical destruction on Earth. Was that accurate?
Well, the sources we looked at push back on that. They clarify that assertion is likely incorrect. Okay, a nuke in space won't make a mushroom cloud like on Earth, but it does generate intense nuclear effects that would degrade or destroy spacecraft. And crucially, one source points out, a detonation could kill or harm astronauts on a space station or even space tourists.
Right, anyone actually in space at the time.
Yeah. And another perspective is that while the EMP itself isn't directly harmful to people on the ground, the effects certainly could be. It could cause massive disruption to critical infrastructure, power grids, communications, finance, everything that relies on satellites or sensitive electronics. For example, an explosion at 100 kilometers altitude could expose maybe 4 million square kilometers below to EP effects.
4 million? That's huge.
Yeah. The 2008 EMP Commission warned an attack like that could cause widespread and long-lasting disruption, potentially leading to many deaths indirectly from the collapse of essential services. And we have historical examples, albeit from tests decades ago. The U.S. Starfish Prime test in '62, 1.44 megatons detonated 400 kilometers up. It damaged satellites, caused EMP effects in Hawaii. A Soviet test that same year, smaller, but reportedly caused a power plant fire in Kazakhstan.
So the chilling insight isn't just lost satellites. It's potentially rendering huge swaths of orbit unusable for everyone for a long time, including Russia itself. It seems almost self-destructive, which brings up that double-edged sword point, right?
Exactly. That's the term often used. A nuclear blast in space would absolutely disable a lot of Russia's own satellites, too. Fratricide, they call it. Which does make you question the logic of putting such a weapon in orbit, where it's potentially vulnerable to detection, maybe even preemptive attack.
So why have it orbiting then?
Well, a nuclear weapon can be delivered on a suborbital path using ballistic missiles. That's how some of those early US and Soviet tests were done. The Soviets even had something called the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, or FOBS, tested with dummy warheads back in the 60s and early 70s.
So if it's so destructive, potentially to themselves too, why develop it at all? And what do we know about Russia's actual research?
Experts mostly suggest the only real logic is deterrence, or maybe a weapon of last resort. Russia seems to believe the U.S. is particularly vulnerable in space because of its heavy reliance on satellites, so maybe they see it as a way to coerce. Our sources suggest a specific Russian satellite, Cosmos 2553, launched back in Feb 2022. It might have been secretly operating as an R&D platform, testing components for this nuclear ASA.
Testing components in orbit.
Potentially. And we know extensive research on high-altitude nuclear explosions is ongoing in Russia, especially at their main nuclear weapons lab, RFY-8's VNIIF, They're using advanced computer simulations, but also, significantly, physical lab experiments.
Actual experiments.
Yes, things like the Luch, Iskra-5, MKV-4, NPMU-1 test beds, studying artificial radiation belts, EMP propagation, even simulating two nukes going off seconds apart. Now, research isn't proof of an active weapon system ready to go, but the fact they're doing physical lab experiments, which isn't happening in the same way in the US or China, according to these sources, is definitely notable. It suggests a serious active program.
This is really crucial for you, the listener, to grasp. This isn't just military strategy. The economic fallout alone from a nuclear detonation in Leo, estimates are in the trillions of dollars. Banking, energy, communications, huge global impact. It really highlights that everyone has an interest in preventing this.
Yeah, the sheer destructive power of something like that nuclear ASAT really throws into sharp relief how inadequate our current international rules might be.
Yeah.
So let's pivot there. What is the legal landscape for preventing space conflict? Where are the gaps?
Well, the main framework, the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, it has significant limits. It bans WMD's weapons of mass destruction in orbit. But it doesn't explicitly ban other types of weapons. Okay. So conventional weapons or these non-kinetic ones aren't covered.
Not explicitly banned by the OST itself, no. And a huge challenge is just defining what counts as the use of force in space. There's no universal agreement on that yet.
So how do we figure out what's prohibited then? Sounds incredibly fuzzy.
It is complex. At the Unidira conference, panelists looked to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. That prohibits the threat or use of force in international relations. And the consensus is yes, that absolutely applies to outer space too. It's fundamental international law.
Okay, so the UN Charter applies. How do they apply it in practice?
To decide if an act is prohibited, you need to look at several things. Is it attributable to a state? Does it happen in international relations? Is it against another state's territorial integrity or political independence? And you also consider the means used, the effects, the severity, and whether there was coercive or hostile intent.
Give me an example.
Sure, so attacking ground stations that control satellites or disabling satellites crucial for disaster relief or financial markets, those actions would likely cross the use of force threshold, but maybe temporarily dazzling a sensor that might fall below it. It depends on the specifics.
Right, context matters. And how do bodies like the UN try to build rules around these complex definitions? Are there different schools of thought?
Broadly, there are two main approaches being debated. One is capabilities-based. That focuses on legally binding treaties, like the draft PPWT treaty trying to prevent placing weapons in space in the first place. The other is behavior-based. That emphasizes voluntary measures, things like transparency, confidence-building measures, agreeing on norms of behavior. TCBMs, they call them.
So treaty versus voluntary guidelines.
Kind of. Some worry treaties could stifle innovation. Others argue voluntary norms just aren't strong enough to stop weaponization. The feeling from the Unidira conference, though, was that the UN Charter's ban on the threat or use of force is a strong enough legal foundation to actually accommodate both approaches working together.
Okay, interesting. Now, our sources mentioned a glimmer of hope. The 2024 group of governmental experts, the GGE, Consensus Report on Preventing a Space Arms Race. What was so special about that?
That GGE report was seen as a really big step, a giant leap for a multilateral effort, because it managed to get consensus by taking a holistic view, integrating perspectives from lots of different countries. That consensus provides a solid base to potentially build a legally binding instrument later. It means they're not starting from zero, which could speed things up. But despite that progress, there's still major worries about the future, especially given, well, recent actions by certain states.
And speaking of those actions, Russia recently vetoed a UN Security Council resolution about banning nuclear weapons in space, didn't they? That seems to contradict that GGE progress.
It certainly does, yes. Russia vetoed a resolution sponsored by the US and Japan. It called on all nations to basically reaffirm the OST ban on nuclear weapons in orbit and commit to not developing them. Russia called it a dirty spectacle, claimed it didn't go far enough because it didn't ban all weapons in space. Then they proposed their own resolution to ban all weapons, which predictably failed. U.S. officials, like Jake Sullivan, pointed out the apparent hypocrisy. If Russia truly has no plans for nuclear weapons in space, why veto a resolution simply reaffirming the existing ban? It really highlights the deep mistrust and the difficulty in finding common ground, especially since, according to some analyses, Russia sees these arms control discussions partly as a way to wage political and legal warfare against the West.
Understanding these complex legal and diplomatic dances is so important for you, the listener, because these negotiations directly affect how safe and usable space stays for everything from your phone signal to weather forecasting to disaster response. It's high-stakes stuff impacting your life. Okay, one theme that keeps coming up in all this is transparency. Why is being open about space activities considered so vital for security?
Transparency is just fundamental. The UNIR conference really drove this home. When activities are transparent, it cuts down on ambiguity. And less ambiguity means more security, less chance of miscalculation leading to escalation. It helps reassure others, stops everyone jumping to worst-case assumptions. Plus, with more private companies involved in space, transparency helps them operate safely too.
So how does it work in practice? Sharing data.
Yeah, things like sharing tracking information, orbital data when satellites are launched, using launch notification systems like the Hague Code of Conduct. These things help monitor activities, avoid collisions, and just generally build trust. Tools like the Unidir Space Security Portal are also useful for consolidating this kind of info.
But surely not everyone wants to be transparent, especially if national security is involved.
That's the tension, absolutely. Panelists acknowledge some states might deliberately not be transparent. Maybe they're worried about revealing technological secrets, or maybe they just lack the resources to participate fully in transparency measures. National security and commercial competition definitely put limits on it. However, the counterargument was made that transparency can actually serve national interests, especially now with open-source intelligence satellites, data analysis making it much harder to hide things anyway. So being deliberately transparent can prevent misunderstandings and actually foster cooperation, even when trust is low.
Okay, that makes sense. Beyond security, there's this related idea of space sustainability. How do security and safety fit into that bigger picture?
Right. Space sustainability is all about keeping space usable for the long term. Now, usually safety refers to preventing accidents and security refers to preventing attacks. But they're deeply intertwined. They have huge spillover effects on each other.
How so?
Take a kinetic AAS test, like Russia's in 2021 or China's back in 2007. That's a security issue. It's an attack, weapons test. But the massive cloud of debris it creates, that becomes a huge sustainability and safety problem. It pollutes the orbit, threatens all satellites, including peaceful ones, for decades.
Right, that debris doesn't discriminate.
Exactly. So the UNIDIRE panelists stressed how important internationally agreed definitions are, like what exactly counts as dangerous space debris, just to manage these interconnected challenges. They also drew links between space activity and climate sustainability on Earth, raising concerns about things like debris falling into remote areas like Point Nemo in the ocean, or the environmental and human impacts, say, in Antarctica, if crucial space capabilities supporting research or safety there were suddenly disrupted.
So it really loops back to Earth. It's not just about stuff floating way up there, but the impact here on the planet and on people.
Precisely. And that brings us to a really critical idea, a human-centric approach to space security. The discussions kept coming back to how central space is for fundamental human needs. We're talking communication, economic development, access to information, especially vital for vulnerable populations. Think emergency services, disaster warnings, search and rescue, all heavily reliant on space tech, especially as climate change impacts increase.
And if we want that human focus, who needs to be part of the conversation? It can't just be military and diplomats, can it?
Absolutely not. Inclusivity and diversity are key. The conference really emphasized bringing in voices from academia, industry, the military, civil society, youth groups, the global south, and ensuring gender balance and geographic diversity too. There was this OS24 youth video competition mentioned, highlighting how important it is for younger generations to be involved. One participant said, "Space connects us and protects us, and in turn, we must protect it."
That's powerful.
It is, and there's huge potential for collaboration with private companies too, the non-governmental entities. They're developing a lot of the tech needed for safe and sustainable operations. It really boils down to recognizing that everyone, states, companies, individuals, we all share a common interest in keeping space peaceful and accessible.
And for you listening, that means remembering the future of space isn't just for governments or billionaires. It's a shared responsibility. It affects all of us. Your understanding, your engagement, it actually matters.
Wow.
What a deep dive we've taken into this complex, often pretty invisible world of outer space security. We've really seen a clear picture emerge, haven't we? Escalating threats, China's kill web, Russia's frankly chilling nuclear ASAP plans, and just the sheer legal complexity of trying to manage a domain where the rules are still in many ways being written.
Yeah, what really stands out is just how interconnected everything is. The tech, the politics, the law, the environmental side. And underpinning it all is that fundamental human reliance on space, which makes securing space, making it sustainable, not just a goal for some, but really a shared imperative for everyone.
It definitely leaves us with a big question maybe for you to ponder. Given all these immense challenges we've talked about, that fog of peace where harmful stuff happens just below the conflict threshold, the dual-use problem with tech, the deep mistrust between major powers, is a truly secure and sustainable space environment actually achievable? Or is that fog inevitably going to lift and reveal open conflict?
And that leads to that crucial thought, right? If space connects and protects us, like those young people said, then how do we collectively protect it?
Maybe the answer starts with really internalizing that phrase in the Outer Space Treaty. Space as the province of all humankind. We really encourage you to keep exploring this. It's fascinating, but it's also critical. Think about how new technologies, even ones that seem benign, can ripple outwards with security implications, and how vital that transparent dialogue and international cooperation are truly for safeguarding our shared future up there.